Hi, everybody. This is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Wednesday, June 5th today, and I'm going to talk about a question that I get somewhat regularly, and yet I never quite feel sure how to answer it. Until recently, I had a personal experience, a personal astrological experience that has led me to develop a few thoughts on the matter. So the question is, how hardwired is the moment of death in an astrological chart? This is a question that's really probably been asked by astrologers, people who are interested in astrology for thousands of years. Understandably, it's a big question that everybody has. When will I die? How long will I live? Will I go in a good way, or will it be difficult? Though it was more popular thousands of years ago to ask the question about one's own death than it is today, we're much more uncomfortable with death, I believe, today than probably our ancestors were thousands of years ago, when death was more of a firsthand, everyday experience, when you were closer to corpses, so to speak, when you were closer to the ash of death. And so in some ways we're distant from it today, and it's a more stigmatized discussion in astrology. I personally don't handle a lot of death charts. I don't work with a lot of clients who have questions about death. Maybe once, maybe twice a year, a few times a year, I'll get a question from someone who is in the process of dying, asking how long do I have left, and they already know they're going to die, or someone who's very old, or something like that, or someone will want to know if their mother who's in hospice will last through the year. I never talk about the moment of death with clients, because I'm not really well versed in the techniques that ancient astrologers use to determine the moment of death, but also because it's really not, a fun topic that really most people are interested in when they come in for a reading. So that being said, I get this question, which is not just when will I die, but the deeper question is really, how preventable is the moment of death? For example, if you see an astrological transit that could indicate death in a person's chart, is there any chance that moment could be mitigated? This is, of course, getting into some pretty gray area, right? Because we're starting to ask questions about life and death, and who has the power over life and death, and who judges when a soul is ready to die. And so I never feel like I can answer the question. For literally, again, thousands of years, though, astrologers have had techniques that have looked at the moment of death, and oftentimes with great accuracy. And most people believe that death, like birth, is a sacred moment that is a part of the soul's, shall we say, contract, right? So a lot of people believe that it's a sacred and destined moment, just like birth. That birth and death are the two sort of destiny portals of this incarnation of the body that the soul is inhabiting. And I believe that too. So I feel uncomfortable answering questions about how avoidable the moment of death is, because it's like asking how much can one manipulate the time of birth? In some way, isn't birth just always destined? Isn't death just always destined? But at the same time, there are tremendous reports throughout the history of the world of people who have had near-death experiences and who have felt as though it was going to be their time, but somehow they entered into an alternative timeline. And this is a common, recurring way of framing a near-death experience that people have. I felt like it wasn't my time. It should have been, or it could have been, but somehow, it was a threshold moment and it ended up not being my time. So I've had people ask me, how hardwired is the moment of death, especially when you see difficult transits coming in advance as astrologers, for health or whatever, is there some way that, you could avert that? And then people, will ask questions about how, like, magic or spirituality or whatever. And again, throughout the history of astrology, there have been different attempts to mitigate the moment of death. For example, one thing that people will attempt to mitigate death by will be, in this day and age, will be, medicine. and all different kinds of techniques and practices meant to keep the body alive and fresh and healthy and to avoid or stave off disease or, the progress of time. Well, similarly in astrology, things like magic have been used. It's a kind of technology, herbalism and magic, things like that. And also spiritual practitioners of a lot of different faith paths have described the way in which, let's say, God or source will take over for a person's karma as they deepen into the surrendering process of their faith. So as one's faith sort of deepens and one is becoming more surrendered to the path of Buddhism or yoga or something like that, it's as if they're, one way I've heard it described is like this, that when one starts surrendering to the path of yoga and one's whole life becomes more and more about absorption in yoga, it's as though if your life and its karma is like a fan that's being powered by, an electrical current, that surrendering into the process of yoga, devotion, etc., is like pulling the cord out of the wall. The blades may have to keep spinning for a while, right, by the momentum of the current, but the current has been taken out. And so your relationship to the cycles of the material world has changed, and to some extent, the reactions to your karma have changed. I would confirm this insofar as, for example, when I drank ayahuasca for a long time, one of the recurring experiences that I had was of seeing, for example, the way in which certain kinds of life choices to reframe my lifestyle and to live in a healthier way would lead to a kind of different outcome or result. And I would be able to see or have visions of where the path would have led in some, at least metaphorical sense, where the path would have led. And the feeling that it could have led there was real. So this idea that everything is fated was not a part of those experiences. For me, it was very clear that fate is to some extent the natural consequences of decision pathways that we make, and they have consequences over time. And that as we become aware of those pathways, not all of them are the momentum of them, not all of the pathways that we're on are inevitable. The momentum in some cases can be stopped, reversed, changed, and the pathway, you can kind of hop out of it. So I've always been really fascinated by this kind of thing because it's kind of science fiction, really. It's like multiple timelines, multiple ways of experiencing reality. And yet there is, to a certain extent, also a sense of fate, of consequence, and material karmic law that's operating all the time that does take you somewhere based on choices and repeated choices. So because the interaction of all of that is so deeply mysterious, I've always felt very hesitant to say, can, your death moment be avoided? Or, because it's like, well, who knows? You know what I mean? Okay. So that's kind of the background of this. And there's a lot more that could be said, but suffice it to say that people have had ways for thousands of years of basically different methods of trying to avert or change fate or destiny, whether it's through magic or religious or spiritual practice. And I would say that we do seem to live in a reality where there is some degree in which necessity and fate, the hard law of karma, is at work all the time. But there's also some, because that fate is bound up in choice, because the fate and choice are inextricable from one another, that there is some sense in which certain kinds of karma are malleable, right? And for example, I've said this so many times, but in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that not even the wisest sages or the wisest people understand karma, understand the mysteries of action and reaction. And so I think my hesitancy has also been just, my mind can't circumscribe that level of reality, of where influence is still open or where it isn't. In this sense, the path of receptivity and surrender, of trying to become more of an instrument of the larger universe or the larger forces or the divine, has always been, I'd say, central to my own sort of faith path, and probably for lots of you too who are listening. Um, uh, but it's sort of a cop out though, right? Because astrologers are supposed to know something about whether or not your fate is movable. And so I get this question a lot: how movable is fate in general, but what to speak of the actual moment of death? So again, this is kind of the background that I've always had. And so talking to people has always been kind of like, well, death is a fated moment in some ways, because we all die, because the material forms are impermanent and they die. It will be caused by chains of action that eventually you can't overcome, because of the nature of impermanence and entropy and so forth as well. Those are part of the laws of the material nature. Your soul is eternal, but the moment of death, like the moment of birth, are part of the ongoing laws and flux of material nature. You probably have some choice over it, but I can't tell you how much. So that was all I was ever able to say until I had an experience this past week. For a number of years now in my life, I've been looking at my progressions. Some of you know what secondary progressions are. Secondary progressions are also sort of similar to what ancient astrologers use, which is sometimes called the directions, or directing the chart. And they're different symbolic ways of advancing planets, and from your birth chart, kind of symbolically advancing them over time. So I'm at a moment right now in my chart where the planet Mars, which is a killing planet in traditional analysis of death, right? Killing planet. Mars is in progression conjoining my sun, and right now to the exact minute, right? So literally as exact as it could be. Actually, it's just passed over that. I've been in anticipation of this moment for a long time. This is one of those moments that I've had to wrestle with my anxiety over. And the reason for that is obvious, right? This is one of those, kind of looks like what ancient astrologers talked about as a potential death transit. I'm pretty young. I'm relatively healthy. There's nothing really that wrong, that wrong with me. So I'm not, I guess, but it's kind of spooked me out. You know what I mean? I'm like, I don't know what's gonna. So, at any rate, all right. So, all of that being said, I had kind of forgotten about it. I had kind of forgotten that I had this transit, and then I had this experience recently that was really, pretty profound. Now, I have to say in advance that I can't claim that this experience gives me any more determinative, knowledge about this subject, but it was a powerful personal experience, and has shifted my thinking on this topic a little. So, and I'm still processing it actually, but so last week, I don't remember what day it was. I think it was Wednesday or something like that. I was sleeping, and I had a dream within which I left my body. It was very, very lucid, like an incredibly lucid dream. And I don't have them that often. I have dreams, but, lucid dreaming, I've had it before, but less so now that I'm not as involved in the ayahuasca world. I used to have it a lot more. So in this dream, I left my body, and I was standing in the corner of the room looking at my body sleeping on the bed. And a number of realizations. The first thing that happened, the very first thing, was the realization that that I had stopped breathing, and that my body there was no life, air, prana flowing through it, that it was lifeless, and that I had a feeling that I had only stopped breathing for maybe like a second, or maybe 2 seconds or something like that, like very short period of time. And I also had the feeling that even though in physical time it had only been a few seconds, that that the quality of time in the dimension that I was in, sort of outside of my body, looking at my body laying there, was infinitely longer, or you could take time there or spend time or something in a different way. It was unclear to me, but time was operating differently. And I was very impressed by it. I actually thought it was really beautiful. And then as I was looking at my body on the bed, I had this realization that was very powerful, which is that there are different dimensions of time. Some are more time bound, or some are less, or even a different way of saying it is that there are different types of time. And, I've heard, obviously, this idea is not new to me, but it was kind of a firsthand, really deep experience of it. And I had experiences like this in ayahuasca ceremonies before, but, it's a little different to have moments like that when you're loaded on the world's most powerful, like plant medicine or whatever, compared to, having it, in a dream while you're sleeping and you're not, there's no substance in your body. So I was laying there and I was looking at my body and realizing that there are these different sort of seasons of time. And it was really impressive. And I realized that the time that I'm used to is the time of my body. And the time of my body is connected to the clock of my breath. And my breath is is elemental. And all of these things should sound pretty obvious, but to me, seeing it from this perspective was sort of just completely mind-blowing. It was like, okay, I'm not, when I'm in my body, my sense of what's real and the sequence in which I process things and have thoughts and do things are all bound up with this clock of the breath. And I was seeing the breath as a physical force, as a force of material nature, like water or wind or waves or, snow or, weather patterns. It was just another force of nature, like rivers or tides. And I was very impressed that just that my life is sort of governed by a clock that's a part of this, it's a force. And that to a certain extent, that force is keeping watch over me, or it's sort of like I'm tethered to that somehow. And it's mostly involuntary. Like I'm not voluntarily breathing, unless I'm meditating or something, but it's just very involuntary. So this was all like just sort of, really amazing. And I realized as I was having all of these thoughts that, again, that like a lot of time was passing, whereas me laying on the bed, it was very clear that not a lot of time had passed, like a few seconds. And then the next thing that occurred to me that was also really important was, obviously, wow, I'm not my body. And looking at my body, I was really impressed to note that the sense that I have of myself as a person, right? That it was its own subtle body. And so it was the first time I think I'd ever seen, again, in a sober state, the difference between a subtle body and a body. And I didn't feel like the subtle body that I was in felt like a small vapor or something like that, like a wisp or something. And it was interesting looking at my body and realizing that the body, that what I'm doing on this subtle body level is being, in one sense, directed by the forces of material nature around me, which include the forces of my body and the laws of my body, much of which I don't have control over, which is sort of set in motion by all of these previous forces. Just like the little tip of the wave that washes up on the shore is, pushed forward by a much larger force behind it, that a lot of the forces of blood and cells and all of these things moving on these subtle levels in my body was caused by greater momentum and force. And that a lot of what happens in my everyday body all of the time is happening from streams of choices and consequences and playouts that date back farther than I can usually track, and that are a part of the larger world and environment around me. And it was just very, very beautiful. And but also it was a realization that the gross part of my body, what you see on the surface, the skin, the look, the feel, the mood of my body, is caused or subtly changed over time by the things happening on more subtle levels, so that the gross was influenced by the subtle. all of this was, again, like after I woke up, I thought, well, some of that seems really obvious, but it's a different kind of, intellectually, some of that stuff might be obvious because we've studied or we've read it or it intuitively makes sense to us. But as those of you know who have maybe had similar kinds of experiences, when you have that kind of experience for yourself, in a dream or a different state of consciousness, it really leaves a mark. Like it's very powerful. So the next thing that happened was, as I was realizing this, all of a sudden I realized that I'm really very different from the gross form that I'm in. And the gross form is trying to be hospitable to my subtle body. It's trying to change and match the mood and choices and direction of my subtle body. But it is not ultimately who I am. It's like a trying to be this sort of friendly host. And also, sometimes can get kind of beat up by my subtle body, depending on what I'm doing to it. And I felt such compassion for my body. Just was really thankful for it. And then I think the next thing that happened, which was again, all of this, it really was as thorough as I'm explaining it. Like it may seem like, how could all of this have happened in a few seconds? But my impression was that I was not breathing, but that I had as much time as I wanted to reflect upon things. Then suddenly I had this realization that of what was on my mind, what was looking at my body laying there. It was as if I was able to see a scene surrounding my life. And it was all of the associations of people and energy and topics and stressors and, enjoyments and things like that I was sort of currently associated with, right? And the kind of loops and cycles and patterns that I was in at that moment. And I had this realization that it matters very much what's on our mind and what we're surrounded with and what our consciousness is like at the moment of death. Again, to some people, this may sound very elementary, but from this perspective, it was pretty profound because I realized that I just hadn't thought of God for a while. Now, the other thing that was kind of nice was realizing that it hadn't been that long, right? Because I have a pretty solid, I'm not anything, but I have a pretty regular prayer practice. And I try to stay in touch with God, with Source. And so it's a daily part of my rhythms. And I realize two things. One, that I just almost like when you ignore or neglect a child or a friend or a lover, and you realize that you've been neglecting them, and all of a sudden you feel really bad. And I had that realization, like, wow, if this were my moment of death, if this were my moment, this would be the jumping off point. It would be these circumstances that would somehow be a part of the backstream of that wave that's going to push the crest right up onto the shore. And I would land somewhere based on this momentum, part of this momentum. And then I also realized that it wasn't just that momentum, though, that I hadn't been so long since I had thought of God or reached out. And so I also had this feeling of like, and don't worry, because you might forget a lot of things when you leave your body and go into the next body. But, those times that you've connected with God live in you forever, because those are eternal memories. Those are really the only kind of memories that are eternal in some way. So it was this reassuring thing to think, even if I were to die and lots of other stuff was on my mind, or fear, desire, or pointless stuff, that it could be a lot worse. It could have been a lot worse. And that was very powerful for me as well. Just kind of like, okay, wow. But this realizing that there was a jumping off point that was there, and that this was a part of it. And I had the realization that my body was only very barely dead. And this was a thought that I had in the dream. I don't know if it's true or not. I'm not saying that I was dead, or I don't know, but I just had the thought, oh, well, I'm not very dead yet. This process is actually going to be quite profound. The process of watching my body die, and of the actual separation, the full separation of the subtle body from the gross form, that's going to be purifying. And some of it will be very scary, and some of it will be very cleansing. But I'll be okay. And everyone is okay because everyone is eternal. This process doesn't stop, and new opportunities continue to present themselves for us to yoke ourselves more closely to the eternal, to the divine. So it's this very beautiful sense of like this kind of like nice reflective space that I'm in is just the very tip of an experience that would go quite deep and be quite profound. And of course, we know that mystics have told us this, whether it's the Egyptian Book of the Dead or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the different transmigration of the soul processes that are outlined in the Puranas or the Vedas, so to speak. So I had a glimpse of that. Now, again, I had many of these same observations and same kinds of experiences over many years with ayahuasca, but this was different because it was connected not to an altered state through an entheogen, but to something that was happening in a dream and in my body while sober. So it was very powerful. Then I had this realization that it became very powerful. There was like a presence that was with me, and I would call it, in the yoga world, I would venture to call it the supersoul, the God that lives in the heart, the higher self. I don't know what it was. I can't say with any certainty, but it felt like a presence that showed up and said, this was one of the moments where you could have passed. And I was just like, oh, okay, I guess, wow, all right. Like, just like, what do you do with that? So I was like, okay. And this could have been one of the moments, but this is not the moment because of choices that you made that were very important. And then the voice just sort of imparted to me, your choices really matter. What you associate with really matters, because this portal, this portal of death, truly is, every time you go through it, it's a process of remembering and deepening into the remembrance of your divine nature and of the divine nature of everyone and everything. I asked the one question that I had in response was, well, why do we forget? Why do we forget? And the answer that came back, which didn't really come from the presence or the voice, it felt more intuitive, like I had answered my own question. And it was because of the associations you make, because of the choices you make to associate with things that make you forget. And it was like I answered my own question. And then I just had this thought that if we don't have enough time to observe our life and reflect upon it, then we don't have time to ask the best questions and discover the wisdom that lives in our heart that can answer our own questions. So it was just this really, I just can't say, I was really up in the air about whether or not I wanted to share this with an audience, because obviously it's a very personal and sort of private experience, and I don't want to dumb it down or cheapen it or try to gain any kind of personal attention for it or anything like that. But it struck me as very important because, I'll get on with it. So what happened was, then I realized, I think I've not been breathing now for a little while, and I don't think I have to die right now. And I could die, but I don't think I have to. And then, basically, then I had this thought of everything that I would leave behind, my children, my wife, like all these different things. And this fear came in. It was really very, very intense. Not dissimilar from an ayahuasca ceremony and some of the fear that, people face in a ceremony. So at that moment, I just kind of, in bed, I took this huge breath. I literally sat straight up in bed with this like huge gasp. And like, again, like I could have been breathing that whole time, and this was just a lucid dream that gave me the impression that I wasn't breathing. Maybe I had stopped breathing for a few seconds. My dad has sleep apnea. When I lay on my back, sometimes I don't snore, but weirdly, sometimes, like, I don't know, since I was like 18, once in a great while, if I lay on my back, I'll wake up gasping like that. Mostly I lay on my side. Please, I beg of all of you listening, do not fill my feed with tons of medical advice or worry or whatever. I always am like hesitant to share personal things on on these videos because people are just so intrusive, and people just act like know-it-alls, and they just want to give you all this advice. And I find that really, really annoying. So I ask that, people refrain from that. But I'm fine. I don't know exactly what happened. But I had the sense as soon as I gasped and woke up, again, not a situation that's completely new to me in my life. I had a sense that it meant something different. And then I recalled that when I woke up in the morning, I went back to bed. And then in the morning when I woke up, I went and sat at my desk, and I thought, I wondered what transits were going on. And I had forgotten all about this quote unquote killing transit, the Mars progression in its fall in Cancer right on my sun, which among other things is associated with death or serious injuries or accidents or, heart attacks, whatever. So, I mean, I was nice and, nice and oblivious about the fact that transit had been going on. And I looked, and it was that day, that Mars to the minute conjoined my sun, and that I had this experience. And so based on all of that, I also remembered that it was maybe a couple of weeks ago that I had a student ask me, because one of my private students and I did a chart for someone who was inquiring about death. And they asked, do you believe that there are different times in life, like a choose your own adventure book, where depending on which kind of pathways you choose, that there are multiple moments that could indicate your death? And it was such a hypothetical question that I was just like, who knows? I mean, like, who could say for certain about that? So at any rate, like I said, I had just given my standard answer, which is, death is a destined event, but choices inform death and birth. It's like ancient astrologers were not 100% deterministic, and not in my mind. And they were not 100% free will oriented either, because there's karmic laws, and choice informs the outcome. You throw a baseball, the karmic law is that it breaks the window. So I always just kind of give that pat answer. And as I was sitting there reflecting on this, I realized, like, this is no longer a pat answer territory for me anymore, because this experience left a mark on my heart. You know what I mean? It left a mark on my spiritual life. And so I don't know. I'm still, like I said, I'm still processing it. But one of the things that I feel, I'm okay. And I don't want to sound like an elitist saying this, but I do believe that in my heart, I believe that maybe it really felt like, anyway, that I was shown one of the potential death moments of my life. And it's weird because I could reflect on so many different things as to why that moment would have been a good one. I can't explain it because it's very personal, but like reflecting, and I'm like, I think I was given a glimpse of one of the possible timeline moments of a death. And interestingly, when I was in the Amazon, when I was in my first or second ceremony, I can't remember which one it was. I think it was the second. I had a vision of basically of dying right around 38 years old. And that was one of the first visions that I had. And that was, something that I also had not thought about for a long time. I had thought about it maybe 6 months ago when I was looking at this very transit, and I thought, well, it's my time. We'll see. Astrologers, we can just drive ourselves kind of bonkers doing this kind of stuff. And like I said, I don't do this with my clients like at all. This is not something that I generally entertain. So I came away feeling like I had seen maybe a potential moment of death. And I was left with the impression that, having made very important choices, I'll tell you some of what I felt they were, but I'm not saying that you need to go and do any of these things. But some of them for me were my diet, changes in my diet that I've made in the last, 15 years, mostly vegetarianism. changes that I've made in terms of the way I handle and manage my, my vitality, my sexual energy, things I did to avoid, drugs and substance and sugar and alcohol and caffeine and just like lots of things that I felt very deeply that had I not chosen to let go of some of those things, that this could have been my moment. Again, I don't know if that's true or not, right? Interesting thing about what's happening in the sky right now that I want to reflect on with you for just a moment is, you know, as we speak, as I'm speaking to you, there is a approaching T-square between the sun, Jupiter, and Neptune, right? And this was just starting to apply through the new moon over the weekend. And as I was starting to process some of this, a family member of ours, I'll just leave it at that. A family member of ours also had maybe a near-death experience, pretty severe injury. So it was also just reflecting on mortality a lot. And I remember, if you listen to my video at the beginning of the month, I said that this month may have something, there may be some spiritual messages this month that may be pretty profound and sort of otherworldly and mystical due to the Jupiter-Neptune square and the opposition from so many planets rolling through Gemini. So this also felt like something that was in accord with all of this, as in my chart right now, Jupiter is moving through the 8th house, which is the house of death. And so, it was quite an experience at any rate. So now what do I think? Well, I feel that the other thing that I felt like really influenced this moment not being the moment of death, if indeed it was one in the first place, which I really don't know, but if it was a potential moment of death in an alternative timeline that I somehow was graced with a vision of, the other thing that struck me as very important was the fact that I've consistently tried and failed to give my life to the divine, to God. And I believe that the biggest takeaway that I have in seeing all of this was also realizing that astrology is really giving us a view of all of the different clocks, the different karmic clocks. There's the karmic clock connected to your breath and your body and your different biorhythms, but there's so many clocks in this world. We sometimes think that there's just one because we have this uniform system of time on planet Earth, but there's actually so many different types of time connected to different forces of nature, and that as our subtle body comes into these different gross bodies, and the subtle body in turn is directed by the soul, that as we jump through experiences in time, different bodies and different flows of time, that astrology is really a view of where the soul with its free agency is jumping into the midst of that flux and flow. And so it gives you a sense of where the timelines are heading, what kinds of events are coming, but it also, because it gives you that view of material reality, you're also able to reflect on yourself as an agent of choice, of consciousness that has some ability to direct and move in that flow. And it also reminded me that, ancient astrologers, for the most part, were interested in what we might generally call moksha, or liberation, which means no longer being grossly identified with that world, but remembering our eternal nature, which in turn has the ability to make those, the way that we flow with the current takes us home. It takes us back to the spiritual world. It takes us to a light body. It takes us out of the recurring hell cycles. So many different ways that mystics have had of talking about this. But it made me realize again that this is really the point of astrology. I say this on my channel almost as often as I give forecasts and reports, because I don't want to lose track. Just for me, I don't want to lose track of that importance. And also because I feel like astrology is something of a missionary field. I know that might sound a little extreme to some people, but I feel like astrology is meant to help us understand the forces of nature and to recognize, that we're not, ultimately, that's not who we are, that we're not just streaming along in Clock Valley. You know what I mean? that we also have some agency, that we're in some ways bound by the laws of the universe, but also we are conscious agents. And so association, what we do with our time, what we surround ourselves with matters, and how we use astrology to understand the landscape so that we can stay in remembrance. That's really, really important. So I hope that my sharing this gives you some good things to think about in your life. Again, one of the things that I'm actually really averse to in general, that I've never really liked, is people who gloat or brag about out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences or Kundalini awakenings, or I just don't like any of that, because I don't think it's a good thing to try to gain a lot of spiritual importance, or to try to, like I'm some special person or something because I had such and such mystical experience. But sometimes we crave the power of these kinds of experiences. And so I really had an internal debate since this happened, I guess, almost a week or two ago now. And I've had this kind of internal debate about whether or not to share the experience with everyone, and decided to share it in the hopes that this would not encourage within people any kind of lust or desire for the experiences, the juice. That's actually one of the biggest takeaways that I had after drinking ayahuasca for a very long time in my life, was that it reached a point where I realized that I was just sort of lusting after these experiences, and that's sort of the essence of Maya. That's sort of the essence of the wheel of fortune and samsara. That there's a forbidden fruit that we just keep wanting to eat, and it takes us out of remembering our eternal nature, which is actually blissful and peaceful and flowing along, the timeless rivers. So I say all this today again, and trusting it to those who are listening, that they might take the truth from it and not take away from it some glorification of altered states or whatever. So I try to do my best with that. But at any rate, I'd love to hear your feedback. If you have had experiences, like these, feel free to share them if you'd like, I guess. But otherwise, what I'm left with is this feeling now. When anyone asks me, so how hardwired is death? I'm going to say, I think it really depends on how you live. I think it really depends on how you live. And I think there might be multiple moments, where astrology might say this could be a moment. And I'm now taking that very seriously, especially after I said one of our family members had a pretty serious accident, and life is short. And so, in the moment of death, what's on our mind, what's on our heart, we may not be able to control everything about the moment of death, but we certainly, our consciousness matters for that moment. So that's one of the maybe simplest things I'm taking away. All right. Thanks everybody for listening. I hope you have a great Wednesday, and we'll be back soon because there's lots of planetary updates to give this month. Okay. Take care. Bye.